right, time to finish up Aminadi in the Lost Manuscript. There we go. The story of Aminadi interpreting the writing on the wall and of the associated destruction of the more wicked part of the nation is a substantive... Wait a minute. Oh, yes. Yeah, this is the section I'm on. Sorry. I was just making sure, because there's sometimes where I stop on the left page, sometimes I stop on the right. But yeah, okay. So the story of Aminadi interpreting the writing on the wall and of the associated destruction of the more wicked part of the nation is a substantive part of the Nephite political and religious history, and, as Brant Gardner posits, would have been included in the comprehensive large plates of Nephi, of which the lost manuscript was an abridgment. See Gardner's Second Witness. And commentator Daniel H. Ludlow has said of Amulek's mention of Aminadi, "This is the only time Aminadi is mentioned, and our present Book of Mormon gives no further details concerning the writing upon the wall of the temple written by the finger of God. Evidently, an account of this incident was recorded on the large plates of Nephi, but Mormon did not include it in his abridgment." Daniel H. Ludlow, A Companion to Your Study of the Book of Mormon. Ludlow's conclusion that the story of Aminadi, although on the large plates of Nephi, must not have been included in Mormon's abridgment, since it's not in the extant text, fails to take into account that much of Mormon's abridgment is lost. For our purposes here, we must also ask, did Mormon select this story for inclusion in his abridgment of them in the lost manuscript? The evidence of the text with regard to its narrative is that Mormon should have included it, would have included it, and in fact did include it. Given the importance and prominence of the event, Mormon should have included it in his abridgment from the large plates. The incidents of Aminadi interpreting the writing on the wall occurred in a central institution of Nephite society, the temple, was miraculously dramatic, and, as we have seen, evidently provided a warning on which the survival of the Nephite nation hinged, enabling the righteous to escape the destruction of the year 320. Furthermore, Mormon would have included it in his abridgment because of his demonstrated editorial purpose. The story of the 320 destruction in general, and of Aminadi's warning in particular, fulfill one of the basic didactic purposes of Mormon's record, to demonstrate that the people's survival on the land depends on keeping God's commandments. For a Mormon to have omitted crucial material of Nephite history that so perfectly advanced his authorial purposes would be baffling. Finally, given how Mormon deals with Amulek's allusion to this story, it seems evident that Mormon had included it earlier in his record. Amulek's account gives evidence that the story was extremely well known among the Nephites. Not only did Amulek himself know of his forebear's story, despite having only recently begun to take an interest in religion, Alma 10:5. He could assume that the people of Ammonihah, better known to us as scriptural book burners than as scripture readers, 14:8, would also know of Aminadi and the writing on the wall. Mormon, like Amulek, felt no need to explain Aminadi's identity beyond this brief mention, apparently assuming his readers would know the significance of the writing on the wall incident. Footnote, Vernal W. Simmons similarly observed, when Mormon wrote the words of Amulek, he apparently felt no further need to explain them. See Simon's People's Places and Prophecies. Royal Skousen notes the abruptness with which this name, like the name Mulek, he spells it twice, M-U-L-O-C-H and M-U-L-E-K, in Mosiah 25:2, is introduced, and he posits that Aminadi, therefore, may have been mentioned in the lost manuscript. Anita Wells similarly reasons that Mormon had introduced Aminadi earlier in his abridgment. Otherwise, one might suppose that he would have either explained the reference or not included it. And I concur, given that Mormon was writing for an audience whose only knowledge of the Nephites would be through through his book. He could only assume that the reader's familiarity with the story if he had included it earlier in his second record. See Royal Skousen's analysis of textual variants of the Book of Mormon. Anita Kramer Wells' Lost But Not Forgotten, the 116 pages, what the Book of Mormon might have included. Mormon's quotation of Amulek's cryptic allusion to Aminadi without further explanation thus attests that he had included the fuller story in the early lost portions of his abridgment. Aminadi and the Nephite Temple. The most striking thing about the story of Aminadi and the writing on the wall is that it reveals about the function of temples among the Nephites. The temple, as seen here, is much more than a house of sacrifice. For the Nephites, as it functions in the story of Aminadi, the temple is where God's presence resides and may be entered, where covenant relationship with God is established or reaffirmed, and where hidden knowledge can be acquired. The writing on the wall by God's finger at the temple of Nephi demonstrated his presence there, the sacredness of the place, and that it was to be kept holy. In the temple manifestation for which Aminadi acted as divine interpreter, the Lord affirmed the oaths he had spoken to Lehi and Nephi, blessing the land to those who would keep the commandments and cursing it to those who would break them. And he did so by writing this covenant with his finger, just as he had Israel's covenant at Sinai. Here, the temple is also a place for inquiring after and receiving hidden knowledge. While a distinctive feature of the narrative is the medium employed to deliver the divine message, namely, the finger of God writing on the temple wall, the most distinctive aspect of this revelation is that while its message was delivered publicly, the content of the message remained hidden until interpreted by Aminadi. Thus, the revelation was unfolded in two stages. First, a presentation of symbols, and only later, and upon inquiry, an interpretation of those symbols. Footnote: a similar revelatory pattern may be found in the corresponding gifts of tongues and interpretation of tongues, to requiring each other, in sequence, to impart full divine revelation. See 1 Corinthians 12:10, also 1 Corinthians 30:14, 1 Corinthians 12:10 and verse 30, and then chapter 14, verses 5 and 13 through 15, and also verses 26 through 28. Yes, sorry, the reason I'm pausing is I'm thinking about my experiences with both the gift of tongues and the interpretation of tongues. There are times where it's done in half measures, meaning that, for example, I knew the story of one guy who, after blessing, was able to speak fluently in the language he needed for his mission. And the other is one where they were given the interpretation of tongues, because if they weren't, they were going to be going, a lot of bad was going to be heaped on them, which they shouldn't have had happen. And so it wasn't one was given and then the other in sequence, but of course those were in circumstances where only half was needed. I think both of them together to find divine revelation is probably needed if one is given in a language where it's not known first, like if they are speaking something very ancient or whatever else, or I think it's only present doubly, like one and then the other sequentially, in very certain circumstances. Anyway, it just goes to, for me, it seems like I sit here and think about the different stories. I've been having a project of writing down spiritual experiences, whether it's important things that are testimonies or actual gifts of the Spirit and what it's like. And so this is a subject that I've been thinking on a lot. And one thing that I felt that I needed to put in my kind of journal that I'm doing for that is that, you know what? We're all God's children, and He will give these gifts according to the faith and belief people have, where it's necessary, whether they're in the church or not. And the reason I think that's important is I remember as a kid, I was having a debate, and the person I was having a debate with, she brought up it was Rinda, but she brought up a story about a Catholic lady who prayed really hard and was healed. And I remember the feeling that she gave by bringing up that story, at least to my mind, was that either how I was presenting things or how I was talking about the gift of healing was something that, well, it should mainly stay in all these gifts of the Spirit and stuff should just mainly be in the Church of Jesus Christ because, well, we're the Church of Jesus Christ on the earth. And I don't know if she took it that way or what, but then the retort of bringing up, well, what about this Catholic lady who was miraculously healed from her cancer because she was praying hard. What about that? And I thought that was interesting because it's like, well, I get it. If you strictly only believe that, it's the priesthood blessings that allow for healing. And it stuck with me because it's like, well, sure, if you get stuck in the mindset that it should only be in the church, then okay, but we're all God's children, and if people believe in Him, even if the full doctrine isn't complete or something like that, why would He not come in and help His children who at least want to believe in Him and do what is right and for His purposes, whatever they are, because He sees it all. He sees each person's individual life and their needs, and He sees the grand scheme of things. Why would He not be able to bless His children? It's funny to me because I think the reason this bothered me so much later on is because I see a lot of people who are anti-Mormons try and throw that up as a straw man. There's two common things. There's a lot of common things that they do, but the two that I'm focusing on is that a lot of times people who are against the Church of Jesus Christ will sit there and say, well, isn't your prophet supposed to be this perfect guy who has no problems and everything like that? Well, if he says something that's not perfect or he prophesies of something that's not perfect, then he's a false prophet, and so everything's false. So they set up the straw man that we think that the prophet's infallible, which we don't. Nor do we say that all prophecies from everything that comes out of these prophets' mouths, like whether it's Brigham Young or Wilford Woodruff or John Taylor or other ones later on, oh, they've got to be perfect. It's like, no. There are times where they're specifically giving warnings from God. And there are times where maybe what they say just hasn't come true yet, or there's all sorts of explanations. Like, that's the holistic thing of the church, is that we're like, you take it all in stride. We've got the scriptures to compare things by. And most importantly, you should have your own relationship with God. And as long as you are really doing things right, you'll be okay. It's like when you go off into these diverse, crazy corners of, Hobbytown and Hobbyville, that you get stuck in these places where you're like, there's a guide rail. The scriptures are a good guide rail to figure out, are you doing what's right? So, anyway, the other thing that they would bring up, not only is make the straw man of the prophet being infallible and then knock it down and say, well, see, this guy said this and this didn't happen, and so, or they did this and this isn't good, and so everything's false, which is a terrible argument, but they make it all the time anyway. And the other has to do with if the gifts of God and gifts of the Spirit come up, um, I feel that at least whether members of the church don't cognitively think of it, there might be a general unknown bias in their mind going, oh, well, yeah, it just happens in the church. And they have a general feeling that they don't see it or they don't think about it outside of the church much, just because they just don't think about it. That's fine, but when you finally are faced with the idea that it happens outside the church, if they use that as it happened outside of what I expected, that's another thing that happens with people who fall away from the church is when they start becoming critical of it, instead of thinking, well, why is this happening? Well, the answer is that we're all God's children. And it's that simple. But if they had this expectation and suddenly their expectation isn't met, and they just, again, go down this rabbit hole because they never thought about it before. There's always this weird danger that people are turned on to some sort of critical thought, and then finally they start finding things that aren't meeting their expectations, and suddenly it rattles them. And instead of going, wait, no, this is just something I need to learn from. This is like when you finally get a light shined on something that you've never seen before, are you going to sit there and go, well, the world's fault? It's like, imagine going down into the depths of the ocean and you see one of those creepy lanternfish for the first time in your life before anything else. This is something completely weird and brand new. You sit there and say, well, all of the world is fake. This is nothing but a simulation. Like, no, you just sit there and go, okay, here's this really crazy looking fish. Let's study it and try and figure out, how did it come to be? So it's just weird to me that some people do this on a religious level. Just, I don't know. It makes me wonder what gets them in that point in the first place. But the other is that, I don't know, I've seen people, like there was a lady who was trying to debate on the abortion front about why abortion's bad, and she always had there was always this one argument that the people who were for abortions gave that bothered her a lot, and she pondered on it a long time. And it was obvious the pattern that she went through was the same pattern that's needed for revelation, where what bothered her was that the pro-abortion people were saying that, that basically children are a parasite, or that it really is that the woman's body is their own, and that, it's as if you had someone who was hooked up to you on a kidney dialysis machine without your consent, that kind of thing. And these arguments bothered her a lot because to her they felt somewhat strong, but she also knew that they were really weak in some way, but she couldn't articulate it. And finally, and she admits, in her interview where I saw this, she says, I got inspired by God, and she gives it credit where credit's due, that it came to me the idea that the womb of a woman is specifically made to house and grow the children. It's not a kidney. It's not another organ. They're not a parasite on that. It was given place in the place that it should be. That womb is specifically made for them to grow. And it is, and it was a wonderful, beautiful, articulated response to the things that troubled her. And so, here you can see someone getting their own personal revelation. You can see, the other people outside who get gifts and blessings from God because they have faith. And to me, it's like, this would be natural. When I was first faced with that counterpoint that was given by my sister, I was like, well, okay, yeah. At first I was like, well, okay, I guess I stated something that triggered this response, but at the same time I'm like, yeah, why should there be a problem with that? And then I had to ponder it further and go, well, of course, why not? And so, you could further on an argument saying, well, if that's the case, then what makes the church any special? And it's like, Well, let me tell you what makes the church special. How about all the fruits of the Spirit? Like, I don't know, if you've heard about the Light and Truth letter, you should read that thing. It's probably one, well, depending on how fast you read. I read slow, because I read it at typically my speaking pace, and I really absorb stuff. And so for me, it would have been like a 3 hour read, because I got through it like in a couple of sittings, just like at work when I was between different tasks and at home. And it was phenomenal. This guy, the Light and Truth letter basically went through and this, he's one of the guys, actually one of his wife is one of the women of Word Radio. But he was going through this faith crisis a long time back. And she basically said to him, fine, no problem, I understand. I'll tell you what though, if you can find a place that has more light and truth than any other place, I will go with you to it. And that kicked him into gear, because then he's like, well, I need to find what is the light and truth that the church brings, and does any other place have as much light and truth? And so he started studying and looking and thinking critically about all this anti-church stuff that he had been listening to. And then he started coming around and going, wait a minute, they're using all these tricks and stuff. And so he made this Light and Truth letter because it was an answer to the CES letter. And he basically shows, look, here's how these people who are against the church use manipulation tactics. These are common ones that happen. And he's not like blaming them and demonizing him. He's just saying that this is how it's done. And that's the really cool thing about the tone in his Light and Truth letter, is a lot of it is along the lines of, yeah, there's some bad actors out there, and here are the bad things that happen or that they do, and you shouldn't fall for it. But you have to understand, it's fine to question, and it's fine to understand that you just need to truly and honestly look at what's out there. And so it's a very, in my perspective, a very forgiving tone to those who are against the church. But he does warn strongly against, look, this is the manipulative tactics that they use. But what's really cool is he has a section on the fruits of the church, because the tone of the antis are, not only is the church, it used to be just, well, the church is silly and it's just false kind of stuff, and here's why. But it's now changed from that because of wokeism. It's not only now the church is wrong, but it's wrong and it's bad, and you're bad for being in it. And part of that comes from the idea that anything that has standards that say that, living alternative lifestyles is not in line with standards, is bad because you're denying their existence, or you're bigoted, or whatever else. He goes on to prove that people who are living alternative lifestyles or have alternative lifestyle proclivities that remain in the church and remain trying to follow the principles of the church fare far better than their counterparts that are outside of the church or leave the church or don't have that stability in their life. And he goes on to show it's not only just for that group, it's for everyone. The better whole life predictors of health, longevity, happiness, everything through the church is so much higher. And these are independent studies that are done. And he puts that all in the Light and Truth letter, and it's really cool. And so when I sit here and think the kind of the mantra that's been around since, I think, Gordon B. Hinckley's time, which is, you have truth in what you already have. Bring that and we'll add to it, is so true. Because I don't care if you're a Shinto priest in Japan, a Buddhist monk in China, a Hindi believer in India, a sheik in Arabia, wherever you're at, if there are moral principles that you follow, the truth behind that, the absolute universal truth behind that, can be attributed back to God, and you can take what you've got and add to it here. that it's like we have eternal families that we can enjoy and be with, and we should help each other, all of us, to do what's right, become better people, follow the pristine example, things like that. And it helps really the dross and the stuff that doesn't matter to fall away. Like even respecting traditions that are ingrained of, hey, you're supposed to do this. You can learn to either say, that is something good that I should keep, or turn around and go, well, wait, is this tradition really helping me? Like, am I hamstringing myself to be of help to my fellow man? Or am I actually harming someone through this tradition? You can start looking at it in that lens and come to better conclusions. So when I sit here and I'm thinking of to bring it all back, when I'm thinking of the gifts of the Spirit, I think they're open to everyone. I think you'll find a greater concentration of them in the Church of Jesus Christ because of the needs and belief and other things like that. And I tend to find them more here, but I would never deny them to the rest of his children. And I would never sit here and think that it's only exclusive to the church. I would absolutely think of these things really as a way for anyone who's ready to be a covenant person, anyone who's ready to take on the challenge of living up to God's standards as something he'll help with when it's needed. And he'll do it also just to regular people. Like there was because we all know the internet has perfectly everything on there that's totally true. But there was a story that I saw online where they were talking about, this mother had a gut feeling. She woke up in the middle of the night extremely worried, and she had no idea why. And the husband was like, yeah, just go ahead and call the children. And she called them, and they're like, what? Yeah, no, everything's fine, sisters are in bed and everything like that. And they go down and they found that the doors were ajar. And later their cameras showed that a bear had wandered in, and the call to their home chased off the bear. It's like family connections and family promptings. Sometimes they're the strongest things, but yet at the same time, I don't think this forgoes God's promises of destruction, like Aminadi, where if you are screwing up and you are turning away from God so much, how can he work with you if you do not allow for any type of light and love and trust and honesty? If you are sitting there completely devoid of wholesome light in your life. Because, you could sit here and say, well, if you're totally strung out, or you're totally, stuck in a hangover, or, yeah, there's those type of states. There's also the emotional types of states of, you're completely devoid of empathy and kindness. And so when God would normally be able to sit there and go, hey, this isn't right, let's stop and think about this, you won't even listen to it. You'll just squish it and run right past and other things like that. Or you're so bent on revenge and having your own petty interests of whatever bad habit you want, whether that is, I'm seeking revenge against my enemy, which leads to destruction and a cycle of violence, or, I just want to go after my hedonistic desires. You go past your conscience and past the whispers of God in your ear to straight on to right into destruction. So sometimes he tries to write on the wall, but we just need to pay attention. So here he was at the temple. We were talking about the gifts of the Spirit, one after the other. Let me find that. If the medium is part of the message, then there is an implicit message to the two-stage process of revelation employed in this event that may tell something about both the Nephite temple and God's expectation of the people of Nephi. And I was also thinking about how sometimes it's a two-step process, because if it's not immediately evident to anyone who sees it, then it means that the people who are seeing it that don't understand it, they may need to work on their connection with God. And so showing that, using it as a wake-up call to you to say, hey, so I don't quite see anything like that where we've had this whole, the church has gone astray and other things like that, but I think the emphasis on more personal revelation is going to be extremely important, because that's being pushed. So that way, if anything happens, we have a way to function, even if we lose communication with the central hub. And more importantly, just have guidance in our own lives. The functions of the temple in this story of Aminadi come into sharper focus when that story is viewed in the context of the other sacred events in which God touches earthly objects with his finger. One such event that we have already encountered in the sacred temple-like context is the translation through the interpreters of the Book of Mormon's lost pages. In that process, Joseph used the sacred instrument to interpret words written on the veil or curtain in front of him, words the Lord later described as that which I have written. That's Doctrine and Covenants 84:57, suggesting the scriptural motif of words being written by his finger. See chapter 3. Other accounts of God touching objects with his finger appear in Scripture. The Aminadi story is one of 3 narratives in Restoration Scripture of God physically touching with his finger, the others being the story of the brother of Jared from the Book of Mormon and the familiar story of Moses at Mount Sinai. Significantly, each of the 3 finger of God stories in the body of the Restoration Scripture occurs in a temple context. The temple context of Aminadi's story is self-evident. Less evident, though still abundantly clear, is the temple context of the writing of the commandments on the tablets at Mount Sinai. Sinai was the original and paradigmatic Israelite temple. God declared the sacredness of Sinai when he told Moses through the burning bush, "Put off thy shoes from off thy feet, for the place whereon thou standest is holy ground." Exodus 3:5. High places like mountains often have sacred significance in the Scriptures that could both symbolically represent and serve as natural temples. Footnote, see Donald W. Perry's Sinai as a Sanctuary and Mountain of God. Joseph Smith would later teach that when God's people are unable to build temples, God uses mountains in place of temples. Quote, the keys are certain signs and words by which false spirits and personages may be detected from true, which cannot be revealed to the elders till the temple is completed. The rich can only get them in the temple. The poor may get them on the mountaintop, as did Moses. Unquote. That comes from Discourse 1, May 1842, as reported by Willard Richards. Well, that's an interesting quote. The rich can get them in the temple, but the poor can get them on the mountaintop. Sorry, that's striking me as funny because in some ways that makes a lot of sense. If you have enough of a society that can build a temple, you could... Oh, fascinating, then. I'm considering what would be necessary to do temple stuff on a mountain. And I think the next book that you chose out of the others that I showed you, In the Language of the Atom, will explain that a lot more. So I guess we'll wait till we get there. But I think that's kind of a fun sentiment that he put in there. It was at Sinai that the tabernacle, the portable temple the Israelites carried with them through the Exodus, was first constructed, enabling them to carry with them the mountain's sacred functions, and in the form of the God-touched stone tablets, a portion of the divine presence manifested there, even when leaving it physically behind. Exodus 31 through 34. The Ark of the Covenant, created to house Sinai's stone tablets and ultimately rest in Solomon's temple, was constructed there. That's Exodus 37 and 2 Chronicles 5:10. Indeed, the temple was built to a great extent to house the presence of God brought from Sinai and born in the ark. See 2 Samuel 7, 1 through 6. An event not known to Aminadi or his contemporaries, but preceding the giving of the law on Sinai and sharing these themes, occurred on Mount Shelem and is narrated in the book of Ether. On this mountain, the cryptically named brother of Jared, while in Exodus from the Tower of Babel to the New World, spoke with God and saw his finger. As Moses went to Sinai to encounter God, so the brother of Jared went to Shelem, presumably because the cloud in which the Lord had been going before the Jaredites had rested on this mountain. And just as the cloud of the biblical Exodus rested on Sinai, see Ether 2, 4 through 5, and also verse 14, and also chapter 3, verse 1. See also Exodus 14, 19, 16, 16, 10, 24, 15 through 16. So he's saying that, the biblical cloud going before the Jaredites was similar to the one in Exodus, and probably rested on the mountain. So on Shelem, as on Sinai, the Lord appeared veiled in the cloud, but then also appeared outside the cloud, unveiling his glory. That's Ether 3 and 13 through 20. And just as the Lord touched 2 stone tablets with his finger to engrave the law upon them, on Shelem, the Lord touched 2 sets of stones, one set provided by the prophet, verse 1, the other by the Lord, verse 23. The first of these sets of stones would shine physical light for the Jaredites on their journey, as the pillar of fire later would for the Israelites. The second set, the stones of the interpreters used by Nephite prophets and Joseph Smith to translate the sacred texts, would shine spiritual light, revealing secret things and hidden things. See Mosiah 8:17 and Alma 37:23. Finally, Shelem's temple function is visible in the interaction there between the brother of Jared and the Lord. As M. Catherine Thomas and P. Scott Ferguson have argued, the experience of the brother of Jared on Shelem, with its elements of divine testing, communication through the veil, the granting of greater light in return for obedience, and entering God's presence, can readily be identified by Latter-day Saints as temple endowment worship. Footnote is, that's Catherine M. Thomas, her book of The Brother of Jared at the Veil, and P. Scott Ferguson's book, Mahonri's Model for the Temple Worship, Rending the Veil of Unbelief. The stories of the natural mountain temples, Sinai and Shelem, share the temple themes identified above from the Aminadi narrative: divine presence, covenant, and hidden knowledge. In the story of Moses and on Mount Sinai, God was present on the mount. Though Moses first encountered him in the burning bush, Exodus 3, and later in a cloud, that's Exodus 24:16, God eventually admitted Moses into his unveiled presence, chapter 33, verses 20 through 23. The Lord and Moses then desired to similarly bring all Israelites into his presence on the mountain. But to their displeasure, the people would have none of it. Exodus 19:10 and also chapter 20:18 through 21. Instead, the Lord touched the stone tablets, transmitting something of himself, both a symbolic presence and an actual holiness, into them. These tablets then not only represented his presence, they embodied it. As if a portion of divinity inherited in the grooved stone that he was understood to be near when the Ark of the Covenant, bearing those tablets, was at hand. The temple was built to be a house for God by housing the stone tablets of the law that he had touched. It was this presence, through the stone tablets, that made the ark the site of the mercy seat, God's throne on earth. See Exodus 25:22. The giving of the commandments by the finger of God on Sinai was regarded as a binding covenant on the children of Israel. See Deuteronomy 5:2, chapter 29, verse 1, and 1 Kings 8:9 and verse 2, Chronicles 5:10, and Galatians 4:24. Before giving the commandments, the Lord pledged to them, "If ye will obey my voice, indeed, and keep my covenant, then ye shall be a peculiar treasure unto me above all people, and ye shall be unto me a kingdom of priests and an holy nation." In response, all the people answered together and said, "All that the Lord hath spoken we will do." Exodus 19:5-8, and Deuteronomy 26:16-19. Contingent on their obedience to this covenant at Sinai, to keep the Lord's commandments was their prosperity and prolonged life on the land of their inheritance. Deuteronomy 5:2 and verses 30-33. In the traditional biblical story of the Ten Commandments, Moses broke the tablets in his wrath over his people's worship of the golden calf. God then provided a replacement, writing the same words again on new tablets. Exodus 34:1-2, Deuteronomy 10:1-2. However, in Joseph Smith's prophetic vision of Deuteronomy 10-2, the passage instead has God withholding from the second set of tablets things that had been written on the first, but for which the Israelites had showed themselves unworthy. From Joseph Smith's Deuteronomy 10:2, "And I will write on the tablets the words that were in the first tablets which thou breakest, save the words of the everlasting covenant of the holy priesthood." These same themes that play out in the story of Aminadi at the temple of Nephi and that of Moses on Mount Sinai appear again in the story of the brother of Jared on Mount Shalem. Just as Moses took the second set of stone tablets that had hewn to Mount Sinai for inspection by God's touch, the brother of Jared took the stones he manufactured up Mount Shalem for illumination by his touch. At Shalem, as in the temple of Nephi in Aminadi's day, the Lord reached his hand through the veil. He then touched the stones one by one with his finger, imparting holiness and power to them, as he had to Moses' stone tablets. In the process, the brother of Jared saw the Lord's hand, provoking a dialogue, which the Lord that tested the brother of Jared's knowledge and faith. He was then admitted into the Lord's presence, and thus redeemed from the fall. Shalem is also associated with covenant in the brother of Jared's story. The Jaredites are described as having a covenant similar to that of the Nephites, through which the Lord promises that they will prosper if they serve him, but threatening their destruction if they take the opposite course. Ether 2:15. Footnote on that. See On the Jaredite Covenant, Lee L. Donaldson's The Plates of Ether and the Covenant of the Book of Mormon. It is unclear in the narrative when this covenant was made, though Moroni's abridgment of the Jaredite record first introduces the covenant in the passages immediately preceding the Jaredites' arrival at the place they called Moriankamer that adjoined Mount Shalem, verse 15. One of the strongest themes of the story of the brother of Jared at Mount Shalem is that of hidden knowledge. There is a public portion of his revelation and a hidden one. Correspondingly, the Book of Ether tells of two records of his experience on the mountain. One we read in the Book of Ether, and the one withheld from us, and contained only in the sealed portion of the golden plates. The brother of Jared was told to write and seal up the panoramic vision he was given of the full story of humankind, past, present, and future. See Ether 3, verse 22 and 27. Moroni, though granting his reader a particle of that world-encompassing revelation in his record, was similarly told to seal up the full account of his vision, of this vision, which he had transcribed onto the golden plates. That's chapter 4, verse 5. Moroni's plates, containing the sealed record, were to be hidden up and withheld because of unbelief. See Ether 4:3. If the sealed plates could be found today, they would still be in an unreadable script lost after the Tower of Babel to all but the now extinct Jaredites, an esoteric language originally given by the finger of God. See Moses 6, verse 46. And comprehensible only to the few who can read it through the interpreters given to the brother of Jared. Ether 322. There are thus two types of plates or tablets containing material from the brother of Jared, unsealed and sealed, paralleling the two sets of tablets given at Sinai, one manifest, one hidden. The unsealed plates parallel the second, unbroken set of stone tablets, which contained only the lesser law. The sealed plates parallel the broken and therefore perhaps unreadable tablets containing the higher law, the texts of each unavailable because of the collective unrighteousness of their intended audiences. Yet even for the reader who cannot read a sealed book, a book hid up and conveyed in an unknowable tongue, Moroni promises that its contents can someday be made available through repentance and faith, like that demonstrated by the brother of Jared. Chapter 4, verse 6 through 7, and verses 13 through 15. Until then, the reader must abide the lesser portion of the revelation in hope of obtaining those greater things. Again, chapter 4, 4 through 13, and 3 Nephi 26, 9 through 10. With this review of the temple-related narratives of the finger of God, we can better discern the temple's functions in the story of Aminadi and other restoration scriptures as a place of entering the divine presence, making covenants, and acquiring hidden knowledge. The writing on the wall of the temple in the Aminadi story by the finger of God symbolizes and actualizes his presence in the temple and further imbues it with divinity. By this writing, he signifies that he had been there, was there yet, and would remain unless or until forced by the sanctuary's pollution to withdraw his presence. It further demonstrates that the temple was to be kept holy in how it was treated, and by those who entered there, keeping themselves holy and keeping his commandments, and thus abiding their end of the covenant. And actually, what's funny is that's a discussion that they had on Ward Radio too, about how we may sit down and have the temple questions, but if someone's struggling with some of that, we often don't sit there and go, well, okay, perhaps you should take care of that first before you go to the temple. Instead, it's along the lines of, well, just work on it, and we still kind of give it a pass. It makes me wonder, what does it mean to pollute the temple? Because, I've gotten an idea of it because, after the saints left Nauvoo because of the mortaring and shelling, because they weren't moving fast enough to leave. Anyway, the Nauvoo temple was desecrated. It eventually got blown over by a tornado, and cows were doing their stuff in there just kind of as a pasture after it was kind of blown down. And, that's kind of an obvious one where it's just if it's left abandoned, no one's keeping it holy and upkeeping it with the proper things that should be done in it. I think temples would become desecrated if, I don't know, that's something that I'm trying to figure out. Is it if they start teaching and doing things in the temple that are really against God's will? Like if someone starts gaining access to the temple, but then specifically preaching against the things that God had established. I think that could be one thing, because then it means it's no longer the proper place of learning. But I guess my ultimate question is does the presence of people who are really, really unworthy to go to the temple make it unholy? The people who are becoming, who let their, basically people who become antis trying to go through the temple and record things or basically flout the um, standards as they go in there. It's like, oh, I totally, people who specifically are becoming against the church, and then they go out and commit, for them, I don't know how deep it goes, because that's just not something I even get into, is, this people who are trying to desecrate holy things. I don't know. I could just, because I don't even look at it, I don't even know how deep it goes. If there are some people who really sit there and go out and I committed adultery and I'm going through the temple just so I can show those guys. It's like, you're only heaping, judgment on yourself if you do something like that. Let's go and specifically do something wrong against someone's standards and religious beliefs, and then go in and desecrate what they consider holy. You're only being you're only heaping judgment on yourself. So, to me, I would think for a temple to truly be fully desecrated and unholy is that either the people as a whole, if the entirety of the church was becoming more wicked, that we were giving up on things like, hey, we should live a chaste life, and hey, we should we should keep people out that we don't agree with. It's like, if we started doing crazy stuff like that as a people, I think as a whole that would start to desecrate the temple, because then even everything that's being taught, even if that was kept the same, if the hearts of the people aren't catching on to the drift that, hey, we need to follow the commandments of Jesus Christ, that would pollute it, because it's like, what's the point of me teaching you this stuff if you're not listening? I can't talk to you when you're like this. Anyways, that's one thing I'll have to ponder more on, because it seems to be a little unanswered to me. God's intention for Israel, as revealed at Sinai, was to bring all his people into his presence. This did not happen to them collectively, but in the parallel story of the brother of Jared, we see it happen to him individually through a temple ordeal or test by which he obtained sure knowledge of God and was redeemed out of the human condition of separation from God. By the light of the Sinai story, the writing by the finger of God on the wall of the temple of Nephi can be seen to recreate the covenant context in which the law was given, and to reaffirm both the Lord's covenant with Lehi and Nephi and also his original covenant with Israel, that if they kept the commandments, they would prosper and see their days prolonged in the promised land. Deuteronomy 5:30 through 33. Placing the Aminadi temple incident in the context of the other events in which the finger of God plays a role, we can see that it involved both lower and higher levels of revelation. The lower level, but vital message to all was essentially that God was present, that the temple of Nephi, like Sinai, was a sacred place and must be treated as such, giving implicit warning against anything or anyone impure entering the temple. The higher level message was the specific content of God's words, as revealed through Aminadi's interpretation thereof. His affirmation of his covenant with their fathers, and whatever other meaning he chose to convey. In each of the three incidents, the Latter-day Saint scripture involving the finger of God, there is a temple context and revelatory knowledge given in lower and higher levels or degrees. The lesser things, which are available to all, and the greater things, which are esoteric, withheld from those, including the mass of the people, who are unprepared for them. The lesser portions of these revelations point to and require further revelation. Either inspired interpretation, plumbing their depths or hidden meanings, or additional revelation supplementing and completing them. Such deeper meanings and higher truths, though hidden from the world, are potentially available to those who purify themselves and inquire, like Lehi, the brother of Jared, and Aminadi at the Temple of Faith. Sadly, the example of Aminadi was lost on the generations that followed after him. These did not grow in spiritual light, but ripened in iniquity. But before the harvest, the Lord would send another messenger into the vineyard, one who, like Aminadi, would warn like Moses, would deliver, and the like brother of Jared would attain the presence of God, Mosiah the first. Next chapter is the Mosiaen Reform. Da, 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 da. Dude, that is a great sum up of everything and bringing it back to Mosiah the first. Ooh, I like it. It's been making me ponder a lot about how do we approach Revelation. And again, going back to the Light and Truth letter that I went off on, I know I've had a bunch of different things hit in my head today, but in the Light and Truth letter, and his discussions on Ward Radio, one thing that becomes evident is that a lot of times members of the church that just get raised in the Church of Jesus Christ just kind of assume that it's always there, and that all that they see is all that there is to it, which is, you go to church on Sunday for 2 hours now instead of 3. You go to maybe young men's and young women's, and go on a mission, and then you have these manuals that are put out that's for the whole general body of the church, all the sweet basic general messages of, hey, we can rely on God, and here's how we can learn from the prophets, and here's how we can learn from the scriptures, and here's how we can, all the very, 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 very basic messages. And so when they grow up and they suddenly have more information available to them, whether it's through the internet and people who are against the Church of Jesus Christ saying, well, did you know that the Mormons believe this? And it's like, well, you're partly right, but at the same time, it's only partly because you're getting a lot of either details wrong, or you're flat out putting it out of context, or other things. But for some generic, kid growing up in the Church of Jesus Christ who puts like zero to minimal effort to learning anything more, they'll be like, I didn't know that. Like I remember being on my mission, and just because I hadn't studied up on all the details about Joseph Smith being martyred at Carthage, some guy brought up, that Joseph Smith and them were trying to escape and shooting back, and I was like, huh? Just because I'm like, these were not details that were handed to me on a silver platter. It's not that they weren't there. It's not that the church didn't give it to us. It's not that it is there. It's just that the focus of the church is, let's make better people. And so the details of, the Joseph Smith and crew in Carthage having a pepperbox pistol handed to them to defend themselves when the mob is shooting at them through the door, and so they shoot back. It's like, he was obviously trying to rattle me or show me that I lacked knowledge, which in that instance and in that specific point, I did at that time. But at the same time, it's like they try and use that ignorance of finer details in church history to rattle the people who are in the church that just haven't put any effort into finding out more details. And I think what's funny is because I'm grateful because of you helping our family to read every morning, the scriptures until our schedules broke that up, set a very good pattern. And there were there was times where the scriptures in the New Testament spoke to me, and I was like, yeah, you remember that Sermon on the Mount? Maybe you want to do that. And so, it helped me to latch on to spirituality young. And when our schedules broke up where we couldn't do it anymore, I started realizing, I'm really lacking something. I started reading the scriptures on my own. And so in some ways, I was very much better prepared for that. And it's always this weird conundrum of how much do you force your kids to do? And hopefully they pick it up on their own. Because if they don't do it all on their own, anyways, besides that, I sit here and think about, that's another rabbit hole, but the main thing I'm thinking about is that I think, just like Don Bradley was ending with, is that when we deny and we turn away from trying to find more details and information, it would be easy to fall into secular or hedonistic patterns. And it doesn't have to be like, I want to go out and drink and smoke and do drugs and go after women and that kind of hedonism, but just our own lack of spiritual feeding, basically. It will leave us empty and hungry for the light of God in our life. And so you don't have to be going out and doing bad stuff. You can just have the absence of good in your life. And it starts to wear on you. And also it leaves you open to these attacks. Like if you have some pop-up on your feed of how Mormons are crazy, it's like, no, members of the Church of Jesus Christ are not crazy. There's reasons behind it, but if all you see is a feed of, well, here's why these people are wrong and they're strange, and you never go into, well, wait a minute, you're supposed to be Christian, and yet here are the things that you still believe, and there's a huge double standard. Whereas if you believe in these things in the Bible, and you sit here and go after the Church of Jesus Christ and say, them Mormons are crazy, and it's like, wait, you believe in this, but you don't believe in this, and there's a very easy correlation between the two. What's your problem? It shows that you're not trying to approach things in good faith. And you could also just be left open to the idea of you just didn't know. And so if it didn't meet your expectations, then you listen to the whispers of, see, they didn't tell you, so they were lying to you. And it's like, no, they weren't lying to you. In fact, they provide everything. Why do you think the church put out the history of the saints? There's 2 giant volumes. They try and make it as palatable as possible, too, which is an amazing feat. You think these books that are this thick, that they actually string into a narrative by taking the original sources and saying, hey, let's follow these certain saints and their experiences because it's an example of the whole of what was happening in the church at the time, and make it something that you could kind of follow as you're going through the history of the church, that they're trying to hand it to you. And even all the dirty, terrible, awful, rotten stuff that people think that, see, they're so horrible. And it's like, here's why and how it happened in the most even keel manner I've ever seen. And they specifically take the stuff that people have tried to defraud the church with, and the anti-Mormon documents and stuff, they will buy it out and publish it so it's available to everybody. I don't see how they can be more transparent than they are. But yet, if people put in zero effort, and suddenly they're like, wait, what about this? Just because they hadn't looked into it, and then they turn away. It's a tragedy. It's just an absolute tragedy. Like, I look forward to that lady who was talking about the Hebrew wedding ritual. I cannot wait for her book to be out. That is going to be on my shelf as soon as it's published because of how amazingly it connects to everything. And that is a perfect example of what Don Bradley's talking about, that here we have all of these parables throughout the New Testament and throughout the Old Testament and throughout the Book of Mormon, because the Hebrew wedding ceremony touches on everything, including what happens in temples and the idea of, trying to come back into God's presence and having eternal families. And it's just like, but the people who will not look for it, not even cursory, will be missing out on it. I mean, I'm lucky that I've got into this. Why? Because I just like, maybe I should have more spiritual things in my YouTube feed. And I found Ward Radio, and I started watching it. I'm like, they're kind of funny, and they're touching on cool stuff. And so it was actually like another group. I think it was the Stick of Joseph came up first, and I watched a couple of theirs, and they're cool, and they're really great guys, and they're very spiritual, but they're very low-key in their tone and energy, and they're like, wow, that's really cool, and, hey, let's explore this more. But they did have a fervor to them that I liked. And then Ward Radio was suggested after that, and they're kind of rambunctious in the way that they approach it, and I like their energy. No, it's not for everyone, I've noticed, but I like their energy. And but it opened my mind to all this stuff, because then later on I started finding this stuff about Don Bradley, because that was the time that he was being interviewed, and and I was just like, whoa. And now, just through listening to these podcasts, I learned so much more because these guys are putting out this stuff, and it is good stuff. The last 116 pages, we're reading that. Next will be In the Language of Adam, and after that, Key to the Keystone. And for your own homework, which I highly recommend to anybody, just because it's a great document, is the Light and Truth Letter, and it's free. You can just download the PDF from his website. He does have it in paperback book, I think, on Amazon if you want something physical. But he's like, look, it's literally the only cost there is the cost of it. He does not want a penny from it, basically. He's just trying to get it in people's hands according to how they want. And since Amazon has to actually physically publish it, it's like, I'm going to pay a couple of bucks for it. But you can get the PDF free, and that's how I read it. I have it on my iPad. But it was literally only through this minimal effort on my part that it's been a treasure trove of information just slapped into my lap that's helped answer decades-old questions that I'm just like, yeah, there's probably some reason for it, but I guess I'll figure out in time. And then I stumble across this, and they actually have these discussions on Word Radio about all these little fiddly things that I'm like, oh, yeah, no, I've been wondering about that for, I don't know, a decade now. And then it's like, oh, here it is. Oh, cool. Wow. So anyways, I hope my children and others just put in that minimal effort to awaken their spirituality, and even if they're passively finding answers to their questions, that they have some source so it can be a good, influence in their life, because then sometimes you'll find things that you didn't even know you were looking for, like the lady with the Hebrew wedding ceremony, which is even older than the Old Testament, as back to Adam and Eve kind of stuff. Like, I didn't know any of that, but because passively it was brought into, by having that door open, it was brought in. It was like, this is so key and so cool. And even if I didn't even have questions on it beforehand, it being poured into the vessel of teach me more, it has filled it up considerably more, and in a glorious way. Well, there's all my musings today. And so now we have the story of Aminadi that we can have next to the brother of Jared, Moses, and more. And next we'll go on to the Messiah reform. Have a great day, Dad. We'll see you.